The world's best school psychologist. When I was 12, I came to the conclusion that everybody in the world, including my own family, was against me. I was never a problem child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For an example, I used to need to be home by 5 p.m. every day. This clearly restricted my amount of so-called playtime outdoors. I wasn't allowed to have friends over to play at my house, nor while I was allowed to go over anyone else's. I had to finish a homework directly after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me any video games and forced me to read books, and then write a book report on them to prove that I actually reading it. Now, even though those rules listed above were quite frustrating to me as a child, they aren't that upsetting to me the most. What really hurt me was the lack of compassion on behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty of accidents or mistakes that I've made. My father would only knew one emotion, and that was frustration. The only time he spoke to me was when he screamed at me for receiving a poor test scores or beat me for misbehaving. But enough about that. Let's talk about my school psychologist. For his own privacy, we will call him Dr. Tanner. I, like most junior high schools, a psychologist is always available on the campus during his school hours to assist any students in need of counseling, whether it is emotional, academic, social, behavioral, etc. To be honest, I have never seen any student talking with Dr. Tanner. Every day, I would walk past his office on my way to the cafeteria and peek through his door, his little window. He would always be alone, in there, working on some paperwork. I guess that most kids were too afraid to speak about their problems to an adult who was practically a stranger, I guess. But for this reason, it kinda took me 3 weeks to muster enough courage to go to his office. March 2nd, 1993, was the day I decided to voice my troubles to Dr. Tanner. During lunch break, I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I could see him raise his head. He smiled and motioned for me to come in, so, that's exactly what I did. He greeted me by introducing himself and asking me for my name. Dr. Tanner was a very spoken man who seemed to be radiating some kindness. In less than 30 minutes, I started rambling to Dr. Tanner about how mean my parents were to me and how they didn't care about me at all. After a while, my voice began to quiver and I couldn't stop shaking. The psychologist listened patiently to my whole spiel, arms folded and head nodding in understanding. I half expected him to start, talking about how everything I just said was untrue and that my parents loved me dearly and, the blah, blah, blah. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned towards me with a grin on his face and said, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise we will fix this." I rolled my eyes. Okay, but how?" I asked him. I have my ways, he replied. I'm a man of my word. I promise that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better. Forever. After a brief pause, he continued, Well, although I do need you to make me a promise. You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow and that you won't tell anyone that we had this conversation today. It'll be our little secret. Well, I promised. The following day, I returned to Dr. Tanner after school. I was around, I think, 4 p.m. when I entered his office. After a warm welcome, he asked me to have a seat in front of his desk once again. Upon sitting down, I watched Dr. Tanner close the blinds of the door's tiny window. There, he would smile, and now we have all the privacy we need, he said. We started talking about my likes and interests, my favorite subjects in school, and my least teachers, and things of the like. About an hour into our conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a small, soft drink. I gladly took the offer, considering my parents never allowed me to drink soda. Then Dr. Tanner reached over to his mini fridge and fidgeted around before setting down 2 open cans of soda on the desk. Afterwards, we continued to talk about what's going on in my life, but it wasn't long before I guess I passed out from whatever drugs Miss Dr. Tanner placed in my drinks. It took me a minute or so to adjust my blurred vision upon waking, and when it did, I had no idea what to think, you know? I was handcuffed to a bed, and my mouth was sealed with a duct tape. I immediately began to panic, screaming and tugging at the cuffs, but I gave up soon after. My eyes widened in disbelief after looking around the room. There were posters of superheroes pinned alongside the walls, and photographs of famous athletes on shelves. In middle of the room, there was a old television and a Super Nintendo with various game cartridges stacked alongside with it. I didn't know what to think. Here I am in a room filled with items most kids would die to play with. I would have probably cried from joy if I hadn't, well, been handcuffed to a bed frame. So my stomach sank once again. As the door opens, I saw Dr. Tanner walk inside. He sat down on the edge of the bed and said, Now listen. Remember that I'm here to help you, and I would do nothing to hurt you, okay? Dr. Tanner gently removed the tape from my mouth, then the cuffs from my hands. My first instinct was begin crying, but something about Dr. Tanner made me feel safe. He would smile at me and said, You're going to be staying here for a little while, and he continued, And during this time, you're allowed to play with any toys in this room while I'm here at home, all right? But when I leave the house, I do need to cuff you to one of your hands back to the bed. I still need to... You can still watch television, and I don't mind that, but I want you to only watch the news channel when I'm away, okay? I sat down in silence, still trying to process the information he had given me. So, Dr. Tanner yipped, slapping me on the knees, and said, You go on ahead and knock yourself out and have fun. I'll be back when it's time for dinner, alright, buddy? He got up from the bed, walked across the room, and clicked the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. All that was left for me to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. I think it was about 7 p.m. Dr. Tanner returned to the room carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally mustered the courage to ask him how long I'd be staying here in this room. "Well, about a month, buddy," he replied to me. "Give or take a few weeks at best. I just have some work I need to do." Well, the following morning, I woke to Dr. Tanner's hand patting my head. Hey, bud. You don't have to be awake right now, but if you don't want to. But I have to put these back on, alright?" He would whisper, clamping a cold steel handcuffs onto my wrist. I gazed up at him. He wasn't wearing a collared shirt and slacks. He had like a coat draped over his shoulder and a suitcase at his side. He looked just how he always did when I saw him around the school. Before leaving, he placed the TV's remote next to me and told me to turn it on and watch the news. Well, first thing upon turning on the news, it said breaking news segment, and an important looking police officer stood at the podium surrounded by the people with microphones. I happened to begin viewing halfway through his speech. "A statewide Amber Alert has been issued as this morning. We have several investigators working towards identifying potential abductors, but as of right now, there is no much evidence. Faculty member states that the boy had been last seen around 4 or 5 in the evening on..." I began to feel nauseous as the photograph of me appeared on my screen. It was my yearbook picture from last year. The caption of the photograph displayed my name and age, my school, and my town. Above my picture were alternating titles that says, "FBI begins search for a child and kidnapping suspect unknown and potential runaway." The live footage continued, and 2 figures I soon recognized as my mom and my dad stepped up to the podium. Both appeared to have reddened eyes. Tears streamed down on my mother's face as she took hold of a microphone. I've never seen so much emotion come from my mother before, as she wept on live television, stuttering every word on sentences such as saying, "Please return my baby back to me, and I am so sorry, and please come home to us." Well, my father took the microphone. I nearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he too had tears in his eyes. He pleaded to the world to bring his son home safely and lastly begged for my forgiveness. I know I haven't been the best father, but god damn it, it would do. I wish I had been now. "Please bring my boy back," he said. I turned the power off shortly after. My emotions were mixed, for I have never seen my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much, but for some odd reason at the same time, I felt relief. I know how much my mom and dad loves me now. Nearly 4 weeks have passed, and Dr. Tanner has been treating me with the utmost respect. He leaves me in his rooms cuffed to the bed frame, but returns in afternoon to eat lunch and dinner with me, talk and play games. I never would have guessed how good Dr. Tanner was at Monopoly and Scrabble. But one morning, when Dr. Tanner woke me up before heading to work, I noticed a stern look on his face. I also realized that it was 3 hours earlier than when he usually wakes me up. You need to watch the news today. No exceptions. I want you to keep the television on all day and pay close attention to it. He stated that grimly. I, of course, complied and watched him exit the room. About, somewhere around 2 hours, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching, and the thing said, human remnants. I think it said remnants found. Two staunch-looking men in suits stood aside one another and began speaking. We are displeased to bring you up such an unfortunate news this morning regarding to our missing child case from the earlier this month. One of the men bowed his head while the other speaking shuffled through some papers. He started to continue. Remains of the body have been found in a garbage bag beneath the highway overpass. The body appears to be of a child, although not much of it is left. The body has been decapitated and much has been burned to ash and bone. The screen shifted over to the helicopter view of the freeway. There was dozens of police cars gathering near the bottom of the overpass. The man's voice could still be heard. Within the bag, police have found a junior high school identification card labeled as such. The screen showed the school ID card that I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but my photograph and my name were intact. After the two men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents. They were sitting among the reporters. My mother's face held a painful grimace, and my father skulled his head down at his knees. I couldn't bear it, so I shut the TV off. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried into the room, unlocked my cuff, and placed a bottle of fizzy water into my hand. He placed his hand onto my shoulder and smiled. Didn't I make you a promise? Didn't I? I nodded, and tears squeezing their way out of my eyes. Now, you need to make me a promise again, he whispered to me. He told me that I need to drink all the water in the bottle, that it would help me sleep, and that from here on out, I would never tell anyone that I never met him. Well, I promised. I told you. I'm the best school psychologist in the world, didn't I? And, well, he was right. I woke up later that night to find myself lying in the middle of the park, stars shining brilliantly across the night sky. Oh, I recognized the park. It wasn't too far away from my school. Well, a mile or so later down the road, I saw my house. The lights were off inside, but I could make out my father sitting on the step leading to the front door. I hesitantly called him out. He lifted his head slowly, but when he saw that it was me, he sprang to his feet, ran towards my arms open, yelling my name out loud. My father was happy, and then my mother erupted from the house behind him. Dr. Tanner was right. Things have changed with my family and I. My parents smiled more often and treated me lovingly. I could not ask for any more of a perfect ending. Every now and then I would see Dr. Tanner on campus, talking to and from his office. Rarely do we ever make eye contact, let alone speak to one another. But sometimes he would shoot a wink at me and smile. I always promised him, and I pretended that I never met him. But there's always be one question that's forever floating in my mind. Who did Dr. Tanner decapitate and throw off the overpass?